Okay, let's pick up where we left off. We're talking about what is the three-term contingency. Well, it is really just a paradigm that can explain a whole lot about a student's behavior. So we know the student is engaging in an interfering behavior. Now, there's a common consequence for engaging that behavior. It might be teachers giving the student all of their attention. It could be the student's assignment is now on the floor and not in, the present, so not being done. It could be a lot of consequences, but whatever it is that seems to be repeatedly happening after the student engages in that interfering behavior, that's what's maintaining the behavior. So we need to fix that, right? And you know some of the basic principles of applied behavior analysis, which is the reinforcement. You've learned about differential reinforcement. And of course, you know about extinction, which means, well, whatever's happening after this interfering behavior needs to stop. So we no longer provide that reinforcement. That maintaining function is no longer there. Therefore, well, possibly after a little burst of the behavior, the student tries real hard to get that consequence, but they soon realize, hey, it's not available anymore. The behavior should go away by theory. But we know there could be a lot of different consequences to behavior, or there could be a lot of different behaviors that could manage to get them that same consequence. So you might be in the same cycle of trying to put every single interfering behavior under extinction. Well, with the three-term contingency, we also have to consider the A in ABC, which is antecedent. So we have to think about the environment, setting the student up for success, setting the student up to engage in the behavior we want to see, making that behavior we don't want to see not working. So there are things that we can do to make this a little bit easier and get out of that cycle of constantly having to reevaluate consequences. What I want to point out to you before we move forward is that some people have different terminology for the three-term contingency. Easiest to remember, ABC, antecedent, behavior, and consequence. But another term for behavior is a response. So the student's responding in a certain situation, and the consequence is actually either reinforcement or punishment. And you know the difference. Reinforcement is something that will increase the likelihood of the behavior continuing in the future, and a punishment is when the behavior decreases in the future. Now, whether it's positive or negative, whether we're applying something or taking something away, that is really irrelevant. The consequence, whatever the consequence, either increases the likelihood of future occurrences or it's going to decrease the likelihood of future occurrences. Anyway, ABC, or maybe antecedent, response, and then reinforcement and punishment. Different ways to think about it. But even more complicated is to think about, is there a four-term contingency? Have you ever heard of that? Well, let's think about it. What if we broke antecedents down, what's happening before the behavior, into two distinct areas that we can focus our attention on to really achieve setting the student up for success? I want to talk to you about setting events and discriminative stimuli. Okay, well, here's an overview, and then I'm going to get into some more detail. First, when I talk about setting events, I'm often going to refer to it as the motivating operation. So this is what happens before the behavior that makes it more likely to occur. It indicates the effectiveness of that reinforcer. So sometimes we want something and it will be serving as a reinforcer for that behavior. Sometimes if we don't want the reinforcer, then we're not going to engage in the behavior because our reinforcer is no good to us. So reinforcers can fluctuate. The same thing could be valuable sometimes or not valuable at another time. And that also will affect the frequency of the behavior. So maybe if the student didn't get enough sleep the night before, well, guess what's really reinforcing the student that day? Sleeping. And the student gets into a fight on the bus. Well, getting attention might be very highly reinforcing when someone has been in a situation like that. Or they may be trying to get sent home so they don't have to ride the bus home in the afternoon. So it might be really reinforcing to engage in behavior that's going to get them picked up from school. I'm just saying, different motivations to engage in behavior depend on the value of that reinforcer at that given time. Secondly, we have our triggering antecedent, which is sometimes called your discriminative stimulus, and it's noted SD. Some people call it an SD. Well, it's what's known to happen immediately prior to the behavior that triggers the behavior. So it might indicate the availability of the reinforcer. So whereas the motivating operation impacted the value of the reinforcer, the reinforcer has to be available, right? So if the teacher asks the student to do a math assignment, and so getting that math assignment, it triggers, hey, getting rid of the assignment could happen. All right, so that is our discriminative stimulus. So the SD is stimuli regularly associated with the behavior, has learning history, and it serves as a cue and increases the probability that behavior will be performed. So a behavior is said to be under stimulus control when response is emitted in the presence of the stimulus produces reinforcement more often than responses occur in the absence, or the S delta, absence of the stimulus. Let's look at an example. If our SD is mom, when mom walks in the room, the child bangs on the table, and the consequence is the mom giving the student some attention. Honey, don't do that. You'll hurt yourself. Well, so the SD is mom. So frequently when mom enters the room, the child knows, hey, I know mom's going to be irritated by this and say something. Dad, on the other hand, doesn't even notice. He's busy thinking about football game all the time. So when dad walks into the room, if the student were to bang on the table, the child would learn really quickly, hey, my dad's going to ignore me. So what happens in the future when the SD's in the room and the child will bang on the table because you know that mom has that reinforcer available. When dad comes into the room, the response to the behavior is no use. So no response. Let's look at another example. Say a teacher. He's in the room. Commonly, the student screams, Teacher Joe, he's going to give that child a break because he doesn't want to hear the screaming. When Teacher Jenny, now she's hardcore, y'all. She's not put up with, inappropriate behavior. So when the screaming happens with Teacher Jenny, there's no break. You might even get more work, if you know what I mean. So student learns from that learned history that when Teacher Joe comes in the room, the attention's available, not attention. The break from work is available, so I'll scream. Well, generally when Teacher Jenny's in the room, screaming's ineffective. There's no break from work available, therefore I will not scream. So, one more example. Would you like to see it? Okay. So, a person, in general, could be an SD. So a student who uses picture symbols for communication might hold out a picture of a spoon to request a spoon. And then a person likely would give a person a spoon if he or she needed a spoon. However, if there's no one in the room, no SD, holding out the picture of the spoon does not get a spoon. That spoon is not available if there's no one in the room to give the spoon to the student. Therefore, with that learned history, when a person's in the room, we learn that's the time to hold up the picture to get the spoon. But when no one's in the room, simply reinforce is just not available, so we don't engage in that behavior. So SDs are very important for us as we think about under what situations is this behavior being triggered, because then we can modify that in the environment or plan for it. One last example. There's a teacher present. A student asks, open the door, and the door is open. But peers, not so helpful. When the student says, open the door, peers are just going to walk on by. So this student learned that the SD, or the discriminative stimuli, are teachers. So the door will get opened if you ask, because they're helpful people. And peers, in this case, not so much. So they won't be opening doors for other students. Therefore, the door is not open. Please don't take offense to my examples and the overgeneralization. I'm just trying to make a point. Let's move on to motivating operations. We have two types. The first one is unlearned or unconditioned. These are just natural motivators for all people, basic life needs. So let's take a look. What could they be? Think for a second. What do we need to live? What would be ultimately motivating for us to do something if we couldn't access something a life need? Food ingestion, right? We'll do a lot for food. Can't live without it. Water, sleep, activity, breathing, and our temperature, as well as painful stimulation to avoid that. So these are all motivators for us that students will engage in behavior if they need these things. Now, we're always in some kind of state of deprivation or satiation, somewhere on that sliding scale. Sometimes we need it more, and sometimes we've had too much. If I sleep for 10 hours and I try to take a nap at 10 o'clock in the morning, I might not be able to sleep. If I just ate a meal, I don't want to eat more food. Those are states of satiation. We're full. Now, if I haven't eaten or I haven't slept, like probably how I feel right now, I would do a lot to access those things. So that would be a state of deprivation in that case. Now, we don't just work for these natural and learned motivating operations. We have other things that have been paired, we've seen be beneficial, that we will be motivated by. And these are called conditioned, or they're learned. Money, for example. Money is not just, we aren't born seeking money, but over time and experiences, money has been able to provide us these life-sustaining needs, as well as other things of enjoyment. Another example might be that many of our responses are evoked by pending disapproval. So we try to please. Why would we be motivated to hold the door open for someone? And they're not really going to give us any money, and they're not going to give us air to breathe if we hold a door open for them. So why are we motivated to do that? Well, we are also motivated by approval of others or disapproval that we want to avoid. So that is something to think about with our students, especially those with special needs that may struggle socially and are always trying to figure out how to get that peer approval or adult approval, and it's not always very obvious to them. So sometimes it's hard to realize that could be what a student is motivated to work for. And some students don't want adult approval. So you also have to think about that. We aren't all trying to seek approval. We could be trying to get disapproval. All right, so one thing about motivating operations, that they're momentary. So we're differentially motivated based on that state, right, of satiation and deprivation. So here in this example, right, normally what motivates us to cook? We're hungry, so we're motivated to cook. But if we go to cook and we grab a hot pan and burn our hand, all of a sudden it becomes this abolishing operation that decreases the value of eating. And then instead, what are we motivated to do? Stop the pain in our hand. So we're motivated to get ice. So you're motivated to get ice for your hand instead of continuing to cook. So all of that could happen in one instant, where one moment all you would do is wanted to eat, but then the next moment you no longer care about that and you're caring about the hot pan. And the reason why I mention this is because it's something you have to really be constantly thinking about with your student. You can't just rely on one reinforcer. Student may not always be motivated. The value of that reinforcer may not always be there. Now, motivating operations have two purposes, or there are two types of them. One, it establishes the value of our reinforcer. So value altering effects, and it also can abolish that value, right? But we also can have behavior frequency be adjusted. So maybe slower engaging in a behavior or less frequent behavior to more frequent behavior based on basically the value at the moment of that reinforcer. So let's look at an example. Food deprivation as an establishing operation. What value altering effect does it have? Well, it increases the value of food as a reinforcer. What behavior altering, evocative effect does it have? Well, you're going to engage in more frequent behavior that gets you access to food. Had a student who was always hungry, apparently, and if we were to not be monitoring him, he would be straight into the trash can looking for food. Turns out he was on a very strict gluten casein-free diet and just wanted to get some Cheetos. And I get it. All right. Food ingestion as a satiation, it's what we call an abolishing operation. So it has a value altering effect, meaning that once you're full, the food has less value as a reinforcer, and the behavior altering effect would be, you guessed it, less frequent behavior engaged that access food. You're not hungry? I'm not going to work so fast anymore. I wish that was my situation with money. I wish I just had so much money that I could just not worry about working so much. Not happening. All right, this is just a summary. So an establishing operation increases the value of the reinforcer and the frequency of behavior. Abolishing operations decrease the value of the reinforcer and decrease the behavior. But really all I really want you to be thinking about is the overall idea of a motivating operation. Like, what is it that makes your reinforcer valuable? Whatever maintains that interfering behavior, what makes that valuable? So, interesting sequence of events. My husband just called and said he wanted to go get Chinese food for lunch, and I am highly motivated to get done with my videos so that we can make that happen. I'm starving. Okay. So, that's good news for you because perhaps the video will be shorter. But first, I want to show you some examples of how a motivating operation can make your 3/4 term contingency altered. All right, so we have a difficult task for a student. Therapist Joe comes in the room, so the student screams. The student gets a break from work. Now remember, difficult task. What happens when therapist Jenny comes in? Do you remember? Right? Screaming didn't work. She's the tough gal. Therefore, the SD and the S delta is indicating that there's no reinforcer. There's no break from work. So screaming is not effective. That's it. Now, for a motivating operation, you have an easy versus a desirable. It's an easy, desirable task. So think about how this might differentially motivate a student. Does the student value getting a break from work if it's a desirable task? Well, let's see. Therapist Joe comes in the room, and guess what? The student doesn't scream because there's just no value to this break from work. Let's check out another one. How about you have soup with no spoon? Right? We've already talked about the situation. There's a person in the room, then that's an SD that indicates a spoon is available. There's someone there to give it to you. So I'll hold up the picture and I get my spoon. But remember, the students learned history. If there's no student in the room, there's no person in the room, there's no way to get that spoon. It's not available. So in that situation, your motivating operation there would have to be that you needed a spoon for your soup. Well, if you already have soup with a spoon in it, and there's a person in the room, do you need to hold out a picture of the spoon to get a spoon? That's right. So if you already have a soup with spoon and a person's in the room, you don't hold out your picture of a spoon because a spoon is not reinforcing anymore. Already eating the soup. Okay? So there we have some ways that MOs affect frequency of behavior, and the value of a reinforcer. Now, MOs increase the value of that reinforcing consequence. They increase the effectiveness of the SD in occasioning the behavior. So even if you have a soup with no spoon, yeah, getting a spoon is reinforcing. But if no one's in the room, then still no reinforcer available. But if you need a spoon, having a person in the room is definitely going to be indicative of getting that picture of the spoon held up to get the spoon. All right, so not only does deprivation of a reinforcer increase the probability of interfering behaviors as an evocative effect, deprivation increases the likelihood that the student would engage in interfering behaviors in the presence of parents, teachers, siblings, and classmates. So we can take advantage of states of deprivation and satiation. Now, I'm not indicating that you should ever starve or overfeed a student. That's not the point. But if a student works for Cheerios, that behavior that they'll work for Cheerios, that behavior needs to be worked on when the student's hungry, before lunch. Okay? So you need to consider what is the state of deprivation versus the state of satiation. For my student who would rummage through the trash can to get Cheerios, really, if he was full after lunch, that behavior didn't occur. The frequency of that behavior was decreased by an abolishing operation. So we didn't have to have a very strict plan. So if we made sure that he had plenty of healthy food, that behavior was easy to manage, as opposed to having to apply some kind of punishment or really keep working on constant reinforcement of not getting in the trash can, just making it so that he didn't need to get in the trash can. See what I mean? Okay, moving on. All right, so let's look at how they are similar. An SD controls the occurrence of behavior because the stimulus has been differentially reinforced. The reinforcing consequence has been available in the presence of the stimulus and unavailable in its absence. Simple. The SD signals the availability of that reinforcing consequence. Whereas an MO, or a motivating operation, it alters the value of that reinforcer if it's available. How much the person wants it will change. The SD changes their chance of actually getting it. So just here in a real Skinner fashion, we'll use the pigeon as an example here. So if a pigeon has not eaten in 10 hours, he's learned maybe light on, food's available, light off, press the lever, no food's available. But if the pigeon hasn't eaten anything for 10 hours, starving, it's probably going to be hitting that lever regardless, just trying to get that food, okay? So we know students who are in states of deprivation are going to have very much more frequent behavior that accesses it. So it's only going to be delivered, though, if that SD is available. If the light's on either way, the pigeon would have to be in a state of deprivation to really be pressing the lever a lot. If he just ate a large amount of food, light's on, that doesn't mean he's going to press the lever because that reinforcer is not really any value. Therefore, it's no longer a reinforcer. It's only reinforcing when he's in a state of deprivation. Okay, so my last point here that I want to make is the matching law. This is a very important thing for you to consider. The goal of any student is to maximize the rate of reinforcement he or she receives for responding to a behavior. Some of the things we have to really think about matching or balancing out for the students is thinking about the quality of the reinforcer, the degree with which that stimulus is preferred. A Coca-Cola versus a water. The magnitude or the number or duration or intensity of the reinforcer. So getting one piece of pie or getting the entire pie. The timing of the reinforcer, which if it's immediate or delayed access, you might get a break now or you can get a break in 2 hours. And then there's that response effort, and this is a biggie. How much work are you asking the student to do to engage in that behavior? How difficult is it? How does that balance out with the quality magnitude and timing of that reinforcer. If you're just giving them just a bite of pie in 2 hours for restraining oneself from getting out of the seat and having on-task behavior, for some students can be very difficult. And would it really be worth a bite of pie at 2 hours down the road? You have to think about that. We need to talk about schedules of reinforcement, because sometimes we don't want to think about giving too much reinforcement, some unnatural, constant amount of reinforcer for a behavior. But simply put, we may have to start with a very dense schedule of reinforcement for a student engaging in a behavior that is very difficult for them. And then if we have a schedule for that reinforcement, we thin it out over time. The student has to engage in more behavior or less behavior to obtain the reinforcer, or a behavior gets less and less reinforcer over time, can thin that schedule out. Therefore, it can be moved toward a more natural schedule of reinforcement. But we may have to start with something more, because we have this matching law. And so simply, students are going to have a certain value to the reinforcer based on how hard you're asking them to work. Okay, well, thanks for your attention, and I am going to get some lunch next time.